I welcome all of you to our monthly Lunch and Learn. We've got a thought leader in social emotional learning with us today, Alex Casillas. He is a researcher in the field of social and emotional learning who has published and presented widely on how these skills are essential for success in a variety of settings. His more recent work focuses on helping historically underrepresented groups to achieve more equitable outcomes in education and work. He's originally from Mexico and a first-generation college student. So welcome, Alex, and welcome everyone to our Lunch and Learn. Let's get started.
Thank you, Joanna. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. And please confirm that you can see those. Also, at any point, if you have questions or something, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I will try to address them as possible. And then I've also allowed some time towards the end of the presentation to have some Q&A to have any discussion, etc. All righty. So the talk is titled Social Emotional Skills, Adapting and Thriving in Life. And it's a pleasure to be here at the NAMI Johnson County Lunch and Learn. I work at ACT, but I'm also an adjunct professor at NYU in their remote counseling program. So I get to interact with grad students in counseling from all over the country, which is a lot of fun. But here are some learning objectives for today, right? So the whole point of Lunch and Learns is that you're going to learn some stuff. So here's three. One is that you're going to be able to define and understand the value of social emotional skills. Also gain exposure to some tips and tools for how you can support your own skill development or the skill development of youth that you work with. And learn how to address some common misconceptions about these skills that you hear in some circles, including policy circles and etc. All right, so the first one about defining and understanding the value of these skills. Let's get right to it. Now, I often call these, and my colleagues often call these social emotional skills, and that's something that's popular in the literature and in some circles, but you hear them by many, many names. And so here are some examples of the names that you might see or hear them. And over the years, they've gone from one set of names to another, and depending on the audience, they might, some of these names may resonate more. But regardless of the name, we're all talking about the same skills. And so what exactly are those skills? So we can define them a little bit. Well, these are interpersonal, emotional management, and task-related behaviors that are important for adaptation into all kinds of settings. And so here are some examples of these skills, right? On the interpersonal side, you might have collaboration, empathy, optimism. On the emotional management side, you have emotion regulation, stress management, self-confidence. And on the task-related side, you have organization, self-control, persistence. And these are all important. Now, they're not just important to me as a person or as a parent or as a spouse. Turns out that the literature, the scientific literature in many areas of psychology affirms that these are important. So the evidence comes from studies and meta-analyses. I'll say a little bit about a meta-analysis in a couple of slides. In the clinical literature, the education literature, the industrial organizational literature that primarily looks at workforce issues, and the health literature. And they're important in a variety of settings. So depending on the setting, like academic, work, or even just life in general, here you see a number of outcomes or a number of criteria that are important, that these skills are important for, right? So it's performing in school, having positive attitudes about school, graduating from high school and enrolling in a post-secondary program and then graduating from that program. These skills are predictive of those outcomes. They're also predictive of a variety of work outcomes, including higher task performance, better work conduct, better leadership, teamwork, and other kind of interpersonal skills, lower turnover rates. So these are important for workforce settings. And of course, as you probably well know, they're also important for a variety of life outcomes. And includes higher life satisfaction, better physical and mental health, as well as higher quality of life and even longer lifespan. Many of these skills predict longer lifespan. So we know that these are important from the research. And the interventions that are aimed at these skills, and I'm going to show an example of school-related interventions, are also effective at driving these skills and driving other outcomes. So this example that I'm about to show you is from a meta-analysis. And so there's a variety of meta-analyses on this. A meta-analysis is just basically a big fancy study that combines individual studies into a big data set and then analyzes the data from the combination of those studies. And what it does is it can, because it's drawing from a much bigger sample of data, it can draw more robust conclusions about a particular set of scientific questions, right? And so in the case of meta-analyses of social emotional skills, what you see is that not only do they improve the skills themselves, which is of course a good thing, but that when you intervene on these skills, you also drive a variety of other outcomes that are important for school, like increase achievement in test scores, reduce emotional distress, reduce problem behaviors, improve attitudes about school and others, as well as more pro-social behavior. And so these interventions are helpful, and most of the research has been done in school settings from the perspective of meta-analyses, but there is a growing literature on adults and workforce that also shows that when you say provide these skills, types of interventions for teachers, that you're able to improve teachers' skills, particularly in managing stress, because we know that teachers are having a really stressful job. And you see the similar things in like healthcare workers, where again, healthcare being a very stressful job. So these interventions that drive these skills actually improve not only the skills themselves, but other related outcomes, which is important. And something that you might not know about is that when you invest in these skills, you have a substantial return on investment. So policymakers often care about these things, right? Governments and even, administrators in schools and districts. And what you've seen in the literature is that, based on analysis by economists, is that when you invest $1 in these types of programs, that your return on investment is up to $11, which is just amazing, right? It's a really high return investment. And those benefits come from all sorts of things. So assuming that you're investing in these, in early education and, all the way up to like middle school or high school settings, you see reduced juvenile crime, lower use of social services like unemployment benefits, higher education and lifetime earnings, which obviously results in more income coming, not just to individuals and communities, but to entire states and the federal government, better mental and physical health. And this all maps onto that $11 of returns. So those are really important, a really important return on investment. And if somebody asks you about like, why should we invest in programs or policies that help to foster these skills, like that's a really good statistic to cite to people, that there's a real value to this. Obviously, there's other values that are important, but there's a real dollar value to this as well that should matter to policymakers. So that's just a brief introduction to some of these issues as to what are these skills and why do we care about them. Now, I'm planning to spend a little bit more of my time talking about some of the tools and some of the tips that you can use to develop your skills. And so in particular, we're going to focus on 3 of them. One is going to be a brief mindfulness exercise. Another one is going to be an emotional management one that is called Name Entertainment. And the last one is just kind of a set of tips for improving attention and focus. And so trying to have different areas, different skill areas that, again, are really helpful to everyone's functioning, whether it be in school, at work, life in general, right? Managing everything that happens. And obviously, since the pandemic, we know that's really important to know how to manage all the stressors that are happening in your life. So starting with mindfulness. Now, many of you are probably familiar with the term, and it's basically the ability to be fully present, to be aware of where we are, what we're doing, and not being overly reactive or overwhelmed by what is going on around us or what might be happening in the future, right? Because often we're kind of worrying about the future, or we're worrying about something that happened in the past, right? And so we're not often present in our own lives. And so while mindfulness is something that every one of us naturally possesses, it is available, it's more available when we practice it on a more regular basis, right? Ideally a daily basis, just like a muscle, right? If you exercise, you can build those muscles like any other set of abilities. If you practice them, you're going to become better at them. So what we're going to do, I'm going to walk you through a brief mindfulness of the breath exercise. Some of you might have already done something like this in the past. It's just it's a very simple form of mindfulness, but it's fairly effective. And the idea is to just simply focus on your breathing, right? Because then you can try and be more mindful about that, at least for a moment. And then really focus on that so that you're not as focused on some of the other distractions that are part of your day to day. So we're going to do a brief exercise. You may either close your eyes, or if you want, you may focus on this nice picture of a pretty garden that is all green and really sunny and calm. And so if possible, I'm going to ask you to, if you're not sitting, to sit in a comfortable position. And then I'm going to ask you to place your hands, one towards the top of your chest and one by your diaphragm, which is, like just slightly above your stomach. Because I'm going to ask you to kind of get a feeling for what that deep breathing that is called diaphragm breathing may look like. And again, since we all have to breathe, like this is an exercise that you can do anywhere, right? And you can do it for 1 minute, you can do it for 5 minutes, even longer, but you can see benefits even if you just do it for a short amount of time. So I'm going to ask you to concentrate your breathing so that only your lower hand moves as you take a deep breath. So we're going to practice a set of breaths first. And so let's go ahead and inhale. And you can feel that lower hand of your diaphragm moving up a little bit and out. And then when you exhale, you feel that lower hand dropping down back onto your tummy. And your upper hand that's over here on your upper chest, that should stay fairly still, right? So that you can again focusing on that diaphragm that is called deeper breathing. Okay. So now we're going to do the real thing. We're gonna close our eyes, or again, just focus on this picture, and we're going to breathe in. Count a little bit, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then slowly release that breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're gonna do a couple more practices of that. Breathe in. One, breathe out, and you make, count about 4 or 5 seconds in between. And as you start practicing that exercise and kind of becoming better at feeling what that deeper breathing feels like, you're welcome to move your hands away. You don't necessarily have to keep them on your chest and your diaphragm anymore. And instead, as you focus on breathing in and breathing out, now we're going to add a little bit of color imagery to it. So we're going to continue to breathe slowly. Hold that breath for a few seconds. And breathe out. And now, as we breathe out, imagine that we're breathing out this sort of any like bad thoughts or anxieties or moodiness or bad juju, whatever you want to call it. And it's sort of this darker, maybe grayish smoke. And as you breathe in light or color or whatever makes you feel at peace. So we're going to try that a couple of times. Breathe in. Hold for a few seconds and breathe out. And as you breathe out, imagine that that breath has all this tension and anxiety and whatever is troubling you. You're breathing that out. It's dissipating into the atmosphere. It's no longer inside you. And as it leaves you, you're feeling more of a sense of calm. You're feeling more of a sense of peace. You're being filled in with light or pretty colors or whatever makes you feel at peace. So we're going to do a couple more of those. Hold that for a few seconds and then breathe out. And again, you can continue to do this for a minute, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. Certainly, if there are times where you feel particularly stressed out or where it seems like there's a lot going on in the world, take a quick pause and do a quick breathing exercise. And you can, close your eyes, you can focus on a nice image. Ideally, if there's green space, because we know from research that green space actually makes us feel better. makes us feel more at peace, or just use color imagery to help you feel like that sense of relaxation, that sense of calm. So you are certainly welcome to continue to practice this, again, at any moment. But this is one example of a fairly simple mindfulness activity that tends to help people. Again, when you practice on a regular basis, you can reap the effects. And some of those effects are that it can help us with attention and help us to think more creatively, more flexibly. It can help us to reduce stress and hypertension. It can help us to have a more of a desire to play and explore rather than just be so focused on some of the negative things. Help us to reduce anxiety, depression, as well as the effects of trauma. It helps us to improve sleep, and it also helps us to decrease burnout, which we know that in some areas, for some folks or for some professions, including teaching and healthcare workers that I mentioned earlier, burnout is real, and it's really impacting our workforce in those areas. And so that's just a quick mindfulness activity. We're going to shift gears a little bit. And in the chat, I'm going to ask you to report how are you feeling today, maybe before this mindfulness exercise, based on the following emotion and color chart that I'm going to be showing you. So take a minute to explore this. And what you're going to see is that it's divided into kind of two main areas or 4 quadrants by 2 main axes. It's energy, either high energy at the top or low energy at the bottom, and pleasant emotions versus unpleasant emotions. So the pleasant emotions are on the right, the unpleasant ones are on the left, and then each quadrant kind of focuses on that energy and pleasantness, unpleasantness combination. Have a quick look at that and just kind of briefly, if you had to list one of those words, feel free to put that in the chat for how you were feeling before, we started this Launch and Learn presentation. And it's whatever the word is, it's fine, right? It's fine to acknowledge that we have these feelings. Now, sometimes this chart can feel a little overwhelming for some folks. So there are different versions of it. One simpler version that you can use with kids, for example, could be something like this, right? Where you just kind of have these emoji that, again, give you a sense as to where you might be on those quadrants. And you can have people point at them or use kind of, simpler descriptions rather than, a lot of big words. But it can be helpful to kind of say, where am I, right? How am I feeling? Now, why might that be important? Well, partly is that in order to regulate our emotions, we first have to label them, right? We have to know what they are. And they are a natural part of life, right? We all experience emotions, and we all experience a range of emotions on a daily basis, right? From really high highs to very low lows and everything in between. And so it's really important for adults and youth to understand and express these emotions in a healthy way. And naming these feelings, naming these emotions can help us to bring some clarity to what we're experiencing, right? It helps us to learn that these are normal, that these vary, that they often vary according to circumstances, right? So we're feeling stressed, anxious, maybe because we are experiencing some events that are more stressful, and that it's okay to have that experience and to have that emotion. And then it helps us to be able to figure out what to do with them. But we can't figure out what to do with them if we don't know what to call them or how they work, right? And so putting these feelings into words can help us at first reduce the intensity of emotions and then figure out how do we deal with them. So it's important as a general basic script that you first identify the emotion being experienced, and then second, you label that emotion, right? Like happy, sad, frustrated, whatever else. And then you express that emotion appropriately through words or through art or other outlets, right? Often we see particularly negative expressions, emotions being expressed in ways that are less appropriate or less adaptive, or in some cases to get people in trouble. And certainly these days, we do not always have a lot of positive role models, at least not in the media. And so how do we become those positive role models for the people that we are around? So I'm going to just walk us through a couple of simple examples. Um, so one, let's say that, your kid is frustrated, angry. And this happens sometimes, during homework time. I know we're in the summer, but um, during the school year, you might say, yes, this homework is frustrating. I bet you just want it to be over already, right? It's non-judgmental. It is just labeling the emotion that they're experiencing about the situation of doing homework as frustrating, right? It's just helping them to identify that. Um, let's say that maybe there's another emotion. And again, I'm using kids as the examples here, but you can put adults and put them in the appropriate situations. And we've all experienced many of these, right? So let's say that your child is feeling anxious about a new activity, right? Because they're just unsure about it. You might say, sounds like you're feeling nervous about soccer practice. Thanks for telling me. Again, it's about helping to model that sharing these emotions is good and labeling these emotions, right? It doesn't matter whether your emotions are positive or negative. Um, it's like you have to, be able to label them in order to then figure out what to do with them. And another, a last example might be, if your child is feeling sad, that their grandparents are leaving or have left today, to go back home, you might say, it's so hard to say goodbye to grandma and grandpa. It's okay to miss them. I miss them too, right? Again, normalizing emotions is really important. And again, it doesn't matter if the emotions are positive or negative, right? Often I think what we learn from others growing up might be that, well, either you shouldn't show emotions, and that's of course kind of a very kind of stoic Midwestern approach to emotions. Um, or if you show emotions, like they should all be like positive emotions, right? Like you should only feel happiness. It's like, well, that negates so much of human experience. And so how about we do a better job modeling that yes, we feel all sorts of emotions. It's okay, right? It's normal. We can label them, and then we can figure out what are the more appropriate and the less appropriate ways of managing those emotions, right? That can be a next step. But first of it, you've got to name it to tame it, which is the example activity. Now, this has benefits as well, right? So we tend to feel more in control and tend to feel more empowered when we can articulate and understand not just our own emotions, but also the emotions that other people might be experiencing, right? It helps to promote empathy and understanding. Um, these emotions then help us to enhance communication, right? Because it helps us to express ourselves and also to understand others. Because human experiences, like if we know how we feel, then it's easier to then figure out how might others be feeling in a similar situation or in the same situation. And again, like with any other skill building activity, regular practice is key, right? In order to benefit from this, you want to be using this on a variety of settings, in a variety of situations, on a regular basis so that you can get into the habit of this. As adults, we probably do this all the time. We probably do this subconsciously, um, but maybe because of the way that that we grew up, we're only doing it for some emotions and not so much for others. And so it's important to also look at ourselves and see how we're doing with this. And then if we're modeling it for anybody else, right, whether it be our peers, our partners, our children, that we're doing this, in a broad enough way that it can capture all the full emotional range. Um, and in particular, it's important to then foster this environment where it's safe for everybody, right, kids and adults, to express emotions without judgment, right? Because the emotion itself, right, there's nothing bad about experiencing anxiety or loneliness or happiness or being, ecstatic. Any of these, right? There's no label on it as far as the judgment, but often in society, we do label things and say, well, you shouldn't feel angry. It's like, why not? It's okay to feel angry. Now, what I do about that anger, right? How I express that, especially behaviorally, that's what sometimes lands people in trouble, right? Depending on the cultural and societal context. So that's another step that then folks need to get some guidance about. How do you manage those properly, right? And express them in ways that are appropriate. But the emotions themselves are important. They're normal, part of the human experience, and we should continue to foster an environment where people can identify them and express them, without judgment. All right, we're gonna shift gears again. And this time we're gonna talk a little bit about how to improve attention and focus. Again, something that I think all of us are often pressed for, like how do we deal with all the things that are happening in our world? And in this illustration, it's like this guy who's just like, all right, I don't know that I can handle all this stuff. Like I need to try and put a time out here. Okay, so I'm going to talk through a series of tips. One that is really helpful is to designate a space. Ideally, it's important to have a space that is, quiet, well lit, free from major distractions, right? So like if you're in an urban environment, if there's lots and lots of noise, etc., that can be really distracting to a lot of people. Um, so if you happen to be in that environment, sometimes you've gotta, put on some headphones or something to try and isolate yourself a little bit from some of that outside noise or outside distractions. In some cases, we may have, the privilege of being able to sit, in a room that is quiet, that's well lit. That's what I'm doing right now because I'm making this presentation. Um, and something that can be really helpful is, this day and age, we all have these, amazing devices that are both like really cool technological gadgets, but they're also horrible for our attention and our focus, right? They're always dinging and they're having notices pop out and all this stuff. Sometimes, especially if you really want to focus your attention on something or having a conversation with someone, it is best to just, mute our devices, maybe put them on airplane mode temporarily, or, put them on silent so that you can limit the distractions. You may also be, if you're trying to focus on something and you often have, websites up, um, you know, weather or news or social media, to turn those off or to minimize those windows and kind of put them in the background so that they're not constantly, you know, doing their usual thing, right? They are designed to grab your attention, right? That technology is literally designed to grab your attention. And so if you want to not focus on those, then you've got to put them away in whatever, virtually or physically, whatever way you works best for you. So designating a space and kind of designing that space to fit your needs, so that you can focus properly is really helpful. Also, obviously, in order to get stuff done, you've got to organize and prioritize and manage your time, right? And we all are busy folks, often have many things going on at the same time, and sometimes it makes it difficult for us to like focus on one task at a time. And people are like, oh, well, I'm good at multitasking. Well, it turns out that the research says that multitasking, like human brains are not designed for multitasking. We are best designed at being able to focus on one thing at a time. And maybe you're focusing on one thing at a time for a few seconds or a few minutes, and then you're shifting to your attention to the next thing, because that's what you call multitasking and what many of us call multitasking. But it doesn't work so well because then, you're using all your energy in just shifting your attention from one thing to the next rather than actually accomplishing that whatever thing you're supposed to be focusing on, right? So one way to help you to prioritize and manage your time are the one that we're probably all familiar with, which is setting up a to-do list, right? When you set up a to-do list, you can then sort that or in whatever priorities are appropriate for you to meet your goals or to meet your needs. And one thing that is very helpful and that is recommended by all experts and supported by research is to break bigger tasks into smaller ones, right? Into smaller chunks that become more manageable. Let's say that I need to write a longer document. Well, that can seem overwhelming if I need to write, like a 10-page report. How do I break that up into smaller chunks? So I could break that up into smaller, like 20-minute chunks or 30-minute chunks. There's actually a Pomodoro, a technique called the Pomodoro technique. There's many different ones. That's one that I often recommend, but there's many different ones that could work for you, where you literally break up your time into smaller chunks. Usually they're 20 to 30-minute times. You could even run a timer right? You turn off all the apps, all the devices that ding, etc. You focus on what you're doing for 20 to 30 minutes. When your timer goes off, you take a short break. Because one of the things that we know is that human attention and focus can only, your resources will only last so long before that you have to kind of refresh a little bit, right? Take a short walk, do a couple of, do even if it's just in your own room or outside, if you can take a walk for a couple of minutes, and then you can go back to your next task, your next 20 or 30-minute period. So being able to prioritize these, use timers or other basic technology, right? Not things that are going to be highly distracting, but just a simple timer, on your watch or on your computer or your phone could help you to focus and your attention on whatever it is that you're supposed to be concentrating on. And in order for us to actually maintain our attention for longer spans, as I was sort of alluding a little bit ago, you need to take your breaks. You need to stay active, engaged, and positive. So when possible, incorporate some physical movement, right? So many of us nowadays are using standing desks because it's better for posture, it's better for a variety, like for your back and everything else. It also helps us to be a little bit more active. So sometimes, I may be attending a meeting and I may be swaying a little bit, right? If I'm not on camera, it's a little bit easier to do, just to kind of be a little bit more active. And then at the end of my meeting, I may do a few steps, or I may go up and down the steps, in my house, just to get my heart rate up a little bit. At lunch, maybe take a short walk, if you can do that, or especially if you can have some green space, because the green spaces really are a way to kind of recharge yourselves. Um, you can also engage in hand-on or interactive activities, right? And so less so in terms of like, getting your electronic devices and doing doom scrolling, right? That's not super helpful. It doesn't help you to recharge for the most part. But what can you do that might engage other parts of you, both in terms of physically and mentally, right? Maybe you can engage in doing a quick puzzle for a little bit. Or if you like to, do knitting or crochet, you might be able to do that for a little bit during a break. Um, Anything that can help to kind of vary the types of activities that you are doing, so that again, when you do need to focus on a particular task or set of tasks, you can do that more effectively. Also, it's really important to celebrate your achievements, even if they're smaller milestones, right? It's important to continue to engage in positive reinforcement, because we know, again, the research shows that that helps us to stay motivated and it helps us with focus. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that costs money, because I know that sometimes folks may have some financial constraints. And so you can reward yourself in all sorts of ways, right? You can reward yourself again by taking a short walk, doing a fun activity for a little bit. Maybe if you're being like really concentrated on something and you like to, you know, listen to some tunes, in order to kind of just like have your brain relax, play music, for a few minutes before you have to go back to concentrate on whatever task, or watch a funny video if you're into like comedy routines or anything like that, that is going to help you to get distracted. Again, it shouldn't always involve screens. I did mention, the watch a funny video, so you can vary that according to whatever are your own interests, your own tastes, and your own access to technology or to the outside. So these are some tools that can be and some tips that can be helpful. And more importantly, like I was alluding with some of the other activities, it is important to practice them on a regular basis, right? So in order to do that, for things like attention and focusing exercises, you can set up a routine and just practice, right? Make focusing part of your regular routine, just like you can make mindfulness part of your regular routine. And in fact, what I mentioned earlier is that when you involve mindfulness types of exercises, like the deep breathing one that I show you, into your routine, you can actually improve your focus and your creativity and your relaxation skills, etc. So one way to build your routine is to include some of these exercises into your daily life, so that you can experience some of these benefits, and make sure that you do in fact practice, if not every day, at least on a pretty regular basis, right? We know that sometimes, when your schedule is disrupted by traveling, right? Some of us were just talking about taking vacations or traveling right before this. Um, Sometimes it's just not as easy to do certain things and that are part of your routine because your schedule is disrupted. But most of us are creatures of habit, and so we benefit from having a routine and benefit from having things that help us to stay organized and keep our attention and our focus. So having this, having a list of things that you can rely on for um, distracting yourself when you need to distract yourself, right? During that 5 minute break that you might be taking in between your focus periods. That can be really helpful, right? That way, if you're feeling particularly stressed about something and you don't necessarily have to come up with that list on the spot, you have your things that you know are helpful. And of course, those vary quite a bit from person to person, but having that list available as part of your routine can also be really, really useful. All right. And then now we're going to move on to the last portion of the presentation, which is addressing some common misconceptions about SE skills. And I've phrased them kind of in the form of questions. You are certainly welcome to put some of your own questions in the chat about like what might be some common misconceptions that you've heard about or that you may have experienced. So I'm going to focus on three. One is like why prioritize these skills over things like core academic skills, which is something that I get that question a lot when working with school professionals and with caregivers. Are these skills and these programs the same thing as therapy? And then do social emotional programs teach critical race theory, something that we hear a bit in our current political environment. So I'll give you a short and a longer answer to each of these. So starting with why prioritize social emotional skills over academics? The short answer is that it's not really about prioritizing one over the other. It's about developing these skills alongside core academic skills, right? We know that these are both very important. Like it's not about one thing or the other. We know that in order for people to be successful in a variety of settings, they need to have both. And so how do we help, kind of approach things from a more holistic approach that recognizes the importance of these skills, right? A more comprehensive education approach, a more comprehensive employee development approach, a more comprehensive development to yourselves can help you to be more successful in all of these settings, academics, work, and life. Also, despite their importance, these skills have not been given the same emphasis historically in school curricula, workforce development programs, etc. And so that's important to at least bring them to people's attention, right? Not that they should have a higher priority, but that they should have at least an equal priority. And because they're important to many contexts, right, including relationships, pursuing plans, staying resilient in the when there's stressful events, including, the global pandemic, it is important to focus on these skills because they help us to deal with all sorts of situations in life. All right. Now, sometimes, right, we want to make the argument that's like, look, they help us not only in our personal lives and in school, but they help us to be better workers, right? And ultimately, many of us, probably most of us, need to work in order to make a living, right? Like I don't know that I know very few people who are set for life because of whatever wealth they have. So there's a number of reports here. I'm just highlighting one that have shown that the majority of the skills that employers and workforce organizations are rating as desirable to succeed in the future of work are actually fall in these sort of social and emotional bucket. So this McKinsey report identified 56 critical skills for the future of work, and 35 of them, which were 63%, if you break them down into percentages, are considered social emotional in nature. So things like empathy, things like humility, things like motivation. So some of them are more technical skills that are not social emotional, right? So they're having to do with like AI and being able to manage particular technologies at work. So those are separate, but within the social and emotional bucket, the majority of organizations and employees rated these skills as highly important. All right, next question. Are these programs, right, that enhance social emotional skills the same thing as therapy? That's a misconception that we sometimes hear. And the short answer is no, they're not the same, but both approaches, right, they're complementary to each other. They both contribute to improve well-being. But they serve different purposes. The longer answer is like, these programs that focus on social emotional skills, they are good for general skill development, for generalized well-being, and they can be applied to a really broad audience, right? They can be implemented in group settings, such as entire classrooms or webinars, etc. Therapy, on the other hand, right, what we often call counseling, is much more targeted, right? It tends to have specialized attention to either one individual or maybe just a few individuals. And it tends to be focused and being delivered by mental health professionals to address specific mental health concerns, right? Could be clinical anxiety, could be depression, could be trauma, and then bringing people back from a level of distress to a more of a baseline level of functioning, right? So it can be implemented again, often in a one-on-one individual basis or sometimes in a small group, but it's a different approach. It's a different focus in terms of the sorts of folks that it tends to impact, but they can be used in complementary ways. So here's one example where you could have a combination of social and emotional programs as well as therapy, depending on the level of need. So in schools and in some other organizations, we often describe interventions as meaning different levels of support, right? Depending on the needs of the individuals. In schools, it's called multi-tier system of supports. And you can integrate this, right? So at the base level, which is called tier one, you may have these universal approaches like that focus on social and emotional skill development that are given to every student, right? And you have basic instruction in some of these skills for all students, and they're just considered universal. At the tier two, you may have some students that have a greater need, and so you may engage in sort of small group discussions or small group interventions with some of these students. And at this level, you may have a combination of social and emotional resources as well as some more that are focused on mental health. Let's say for some students that are, maybe more anxiety prone or who are going through a difficult time because of family situations or because they're experiencing poverty or any number of issues. And then at tier three, that's where you might have the much more intensive type of interventions that are usually focused much more on mental health, right? For individuals who may be experiencing really high anxiety, clinical levels of depression, potentially suicidal thoughts, or any number of other things that are really the focus of more clinical and more targeted types of concerns. So this is one way in which these approaches are complementary, but they are clearly not the same. And then the last question is, do these programs like social and emotional skill programs, do they teach CRT, which is, critical race theory? You hear about this in the news all the time, particularly in some circles. The short answer is no. These programs do not teach critical race theory. The longer answer is that CRT is actually a fairly complex academic theory, and it tends to be taught in college or even graduate school. And to be honest, even in my own college education, I did not receive any instruction on CRT. And it wasn't even until some grad school material that I got some exposure to it. It is not part of regular K through 12 programs. It's not really part of regular life for most of us. And so what social emotional learning programs are designed to do is that they're based on evidence from research and from best practices that have been shown to improve the development of these skills for students and for adults, right? However, it is important to take a lens of like, how do these practices, how can they be helpful to a broad range of populations, right? We're not all the same. We don't all come from the same places. And so in order for programming, whether it be social emotional skills programming or any programming, including math and reading and science, for this programming to be effective, we need to be responsive to the conditions of for the individuals and their communities where they're at, right? And that means that in some cases, we need to be responsive to poverty. We need to be responsive to discrimination. We need to be responsive to any of the other conditions that may be impacting the individuals and their communities and their ability to succeed, to thrive, to have access to opportunities or access to using these programs for these programs to be effective, right? So even though these programs do not focus on CRT, we also cannot turn a blind eye and say that, well, all of our interventions or all of our curricula are completely colorblind, or they are blind to any of the other circumstances that we know many of us and many of our friends and neighbors experience, right? If we want these programs to be effective, we need to make sure that they're actually going to meet the needs of the people that these programs are serving. And by saying that they're always delivered the same to people that we assume are the same, it's silly, because people are not the same and they don't have the same context, the same background. So in closing, these skills, social emotional skills, are important across a variety of settings. They predict a variety of outcomes and they show substantial return on investment, right? So you already need to argue with a policymaker about this. Here's a few bullet points. Um, these skills can be developed, and there's a number of research-based and best practices interventions that can be helpful, right? They are effective. They can include mindfulness, they can include emotion regulation, starting with emotion recognition, and they can include activities to improve your attention and your focus so that you can be more effective at whatever it is that you need to get done. And if people have misconceptions about this stuff, just like they have misconceptions about lots of things, and these misconceptions can be addressed factually, right? By saying, here are the facts. Yeah, here's what the research says. Here's what best practices are. Like, it's not just what social media or Fox News or whatever other outlet that you might follow says. It's important to do, a little bit of critical thinking and to get data from well-informed resources. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that people may have. Feel free to either put them on the chat or just unmute yourselves and ask them. We've got a little bit of time. Thank you for your attention.
This comes at such a good time. We've been reading about how many school boards are making outrageous demands on their teachers, and that confusion between social emotional and CRT, and I just can't understand if you look at the facts here, why people would be against it. I could have benefited from it. I know all of us could have in my days in elementary school.
Absolutely, right. And it's not just elementary school, although like many
Right, right.
interventions, the younger you start, the better, like the more effects that you're likely to see. But
Yes.
certainly, you can start at any age and still benefit from, or really any setting and still benefit from these. And I see that Matt has a question.
Yeah, so on the topic of, the first misconception, the one about it taking time away from core academic skills, are there any approaches or any research on like how to somehow integrate it with like English and math, as a way of addressing that concern?
Yeah, there's certainly some best practices that people are starting to try out. I'm not aware of like, full like experiments that have controlled these, really tightly so that we can say, hey, this classroom that did these in this way did X percentage better in their math test than this other classroom. But some of these things is that we all know that, some kids end up finding math easier or more engaging than others, right? That is just a natural part, or any subject, right? I'm going to focus on math for a second. And so one way of leveraging these skills is to, help kids identify, okay, so you may be feeling a little bit anxious around doing this math. You might feel a little bit confused. Like, let's unpack that for a minute. And perhaps, engaging in a little bit of mindfulness for kids who might naturally have some math anxiety will be much more productive, so that they can sort of feel a little bit more at peace and rather than anxious before they start tackling math, right? Or if they get frustrated when they're trying to solve, their algebra problems, it's like, I'm just not getting it. It's like, okay, well, sometimes it helps to put things away for a few minutes.
Right.
Again, do a little focusing or breathing exercise, and then come back and take a look at it from a fresh perspective, right? Because while I have sometimes noticed with my own kids and just people in general, is that you get frustrated at something and you kind of keep going and going and kind of beating your head against the wall. And you're not going to get it any better by doing the same thing over and over. Chances are there's actually, you're going to get more frustrated rather than looking at it from a different perspective. And these skills allow you, both from the emotional perspective and from, taking a look from different perspectives when you start thinking about like creativity and openness, that it actually enhances your ability to do well in those core subjects. So like my argument is to actually flip it around and say, I would like you to show me how people can actually do well in these materials, whether it be math, reading, science, anything, without these skills. I think we all naturally draw on these skills, often we're not aware of it, in order to learn. And so, if anything, I think these skills are foundational so that kids and all of us can learn more effectively.
Thanks.
Yeah, I can see, English teachers, language teachers, reading teachers really speaking to maybe how a character behaves and say, point out some of the emotions that they're having and how that's helping or hindering them, Right.
Absolutely. And
Mhm.
even within science, for example, or history, increasingly people are starting to, in education, they're starting to engage in what is called project-based learning, right? Where they might have a project that students focus on to like do research on a character in history, or do a little experiment, out in out in the out in the field and collect some data and then test out some hypotheses. Well, in order to do that, right, in order to do that, whether individually or increasingly as a team, you've got to be able to collaborate. You've got to be able to agree on what your plan is. You've got to be able to say, okay, well, who's going to play this role, right? I might be collecting some data, somebody else might be taking notes, somebody else might be summarizing things, or we're going to end up making a presentation at the end. Who's going to have which role? All of these things, these are all primarily social emotional in nature. And guess what? In the workforce, even if you're working in a factory setting making widgets, you depend on other people to make, say, a certain part of the widget before it gets to you. And so collaboration, communication, empathy, all of these skills are essential to being able to get that done. So long are the days where like somebody could sit at their own desk by themselves all of the time at work and be effective. I don't know that that really truly existed, but now that we're all interconnected in many ways, it doesn't really exist anymore.
I do know that parents these days, many parents are doing a much better job than I did of helping their children understand their emotions and name them.
Yeah, I
And
think that's really great. And
really
yet,
good. Yeah.
when we ask parents and caregivers about some of this stuff, most of them say, I would really appreciate some more guidance about it, right? Because nowadays you start to see these curricula that focus on these skills in the schools, and occasionally they might even do some of that development in their teachers for professional development so the teachers can teach these content. But rarely do we actually reach out to the parents and say, hey, here's a list of strategies, and here's, like some quick videos or some worksheets or things that you can do to help not only your own skills, but to help model these for kids, right? And so that's really one of the missing pieces of, in my line of work. It's like we need to be able to focus on these skills for the full range of populations, right? The full range of stakeholders, not just for students, because often it's the adults that need these skills more than the students do, to be honest.
Well, great. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much, Alex. That was wonderful presentation. I'd love a copy of those slides. You obviously were willing to be recorded, and we'll have this on our YouTube channel, our NAMI Johnson County YouTube channel. If any of you would like to share that with friends and colleagues, please do. And we'll see you all next month.
Great, thank you for having me. And yes, I'll send you my a PDF of the slides.
Great.
Take care, everybody.